All right. Well, welcome everyone. Hopefully, most of you have been here for part one and part two. We're starting up in part three. We're going to be covering some options to if we can't get you out of a flood zone. I did want to go back and just really quick revamp what we had kind of cover the floodway issue that we had covered last in the part two. And the reason is because if a house shows up in a floodway, it's very serious. You do not want your clients buying a house in a floodway. And if a house gets damaged by floods or damaged by a fire, your buyer, if they buy a house in a floodway, will never be able to rebuild their house. And so I just want to stress that this is really an important thing that we as realtors need to do when we look up properties, when we're going to have a homeowner purchase a property, we really want to look up the properties ourselves, making sure that homeowners are not purchasing properties in floodways. Okay. We did describe what a floodway is, and I want to real quick point that out in case, just as kind of a refresher for those of you who were here last time and those of you who weren't. This is a flood map, and everything in blue is flood zone, and this cross hatching in the middle, this is floodway. So this house right here, if you were your buyer was about to buy this house, you should be concerned if you look at a map and you see floodway cutting through the middle. Remember, if this house can't be removed from a flood zone, and again, we don't know unless we check the elevation of it, but if we find it can't be removed, then it's going to, if it ever is damaged by fire or ever damaged by a flood, you would never be able to rebuild this house. You would have to tear it down and sell it to the city as a park or sell it to your neighbor as a baseball field. So this is why, and nobody out there is going to tell your buyer that they're buying a house in a floodway. Only the realtor will know. Okay. I don't believe anybody along the train anywhere along the way when a house is being purchased, nobody's going to red flag this. So I just wanted to go back and explain that floodway issue too, because that's very, very, very important. Okay. So we kind of covered all these things. Now let's jump right into it. If we check a house and we find that the house is unable to be removed from a flood zone, and by that I mean if I check the ground physically on the outside of a house and it's too low, then we switch gears while we're in the field. Right then we say, okay, what can we do? Is there anything we can do to help the property owner, help the buyer, help the seller make this house marketable again? And that is where an elevation certificate comes in. It's important to understand that for years and years, people have done elevation certificates on homes, which is a 4 or 5 page report. And the purpose of an elevation certificate is to quote you for flood insurance. So if you're representing a buyer or seller, they may tell you early on, like for instance, the seller might say, well, we've already had this house removed. But then when you start researching it further, you might find that it was never removed. All they had was an elevation certificate done. And some lender said, no, you're not required to pay flood insurance. Okay. But elevation certificates cannot be used for that purpose anymore. You can't get out of flood insurance by doing an elevation certificate. You have to move forward and do what's called the LOMA process. Okay. So when would an elevation certificate be needed? It would be needed when we know we can't get it out of a flood zone. Okay. That would be when we switch gears in the field and say, okay, is this house possibly going to be, can we help the house by doing an elevation certificate on it? Okay. The other thing I want to caution you about is, again, for years and years, people have had surveyors do elevation certificates on their home, but many of them have a whole bunch of mistakes on them. And even to this day, if you hire a surveyor to do an elevation certificate and you're mistaken, even though you shouldn't have, instead we should have hired to get them out. But if for some reason somebody's got an elevation certificate, they can still send it to my office. And I've cloned myself like 6 times here. And everybody in my office is very well versed on how to find mistakes on those elevation certificates. So if we have an elevation certificate sent to us, we're going to tell you whether there's a lot of mistakes. If there are, then chances are you kind of need a second opinion. Okay, so elevation certificates, again, lots of mistakes. We only do them if as an alternative. If I can't get you out of a flood zone, then I might be doing an elevation certificate to get the premiums reduced so the house is marketable. And again, you can't, an elevation certificate doesn't always get the price premiums down. So we're going to look at that early on and say whether we think it's going to help or not. And the other thing we're always going to ask when people call is we're going to ask you the age of the house, because if the house was built before the first flood insurance rate map, and that's what this firm is, FIRM is a flood insurance rate map. If the house was built prior to that first map for that area, then it's considered a pre-firm house, okay? So what does that mean? That means that FEMA is most likely not going to punish you with really high premiums, at least not yet, okay? They eventually will be punishing you because they're going to remove all the subsidies and all of the grandfathering, and it's going to happen soon. But right now, your client, if they have an older house, can still unload that house and the buyer would still be able to get a relatively, if you want to call it that, cheap flood premiums, okay? Because it's an older home. Now, if you have a newer home, which is a post-firm, it was built after the first flood maps, then you're going to get socked big time with premiums, okay? So when you have those newer homes that were built in flood zones, and I can't get that house out of a flood zone, very often your buyer is going to get hit with really extreme flood premiums, okay? And again, if we know we can help you get it down, then we would proceed with what's called that elevation certificate, all right? So that law, BW 12, which we talked about before, it was the Bigger Waters Act of 2012. When that came into effect, okay, that pulled back a whole bunch of things. And it kicked, and it's going to kick back in. Most of it's kicking back in right now. The one thing from BW 12 that hasn't kicked in is they have not removed all the subsidies. They haven't removed all the grandfathering. So if you have an older home, you are still able to get relatively cheaper premiums for flood insurance if I can't get you out of a flood zone. So that's what that BW 12 does. The other thing is right now, if you have a newer home, and we're going to have to write a flood policy on it, then elevation certificates are going to have to be done on the newer homes. And that's a requirement that kicked in with the BW 12. Okay. So whether we like it or not, that's where we're at. And then no offense to our insurance agents, but for the most part, many of our insurance agents are clueless, okay? They need to be educated, and we need to educate them as a whole. And what is it that we really want to educate our insurance agents on, besides writing a flood policy and reading those elevation certificates? We want to teach an insurance agent that when somebody hands them an elevation certificate to be quoted for flood insurance, FEMA has taught them we're going to rate them based on the lowest floor in the structure, okay? But the fact of the matter is that if the lowest adjacent grade outside of that structure where the ground meets the house is at or above the flood zone, that house qualifies to be removed, okay? So many insurance agents do not realize this. So people will give them an elevation certificate, and they're going to use it to write the policy, and they're going to take a look at the lowest floor on that document, and they're going to say, oh, you've got a floor that's 8 feet into a flood zone. That's a -8 rating. That's $8,000 a year, okay? But the fact of the matter is if we can teach our insurance agents to quit looking at that lowest floor first and start looking at where the ground meets the structure, because if that ground is at or above the flood zone, the house can be removed. We don't have to force flood insurance, okay? So we try and catch these things before they get to an insurance agent, but we'd like our insurance agents to catch them if they get to them and they're about to start taking money out of Michigan and throwing them into the big FEMA pot. All right. And so let's talk a little bit about, we're actually just going to go back a little bit. I want to just recap. We talked about LOMAs the last time we were here, and a LOMA is called a letter of map amendment, okay? And when we do a LOMA on a house, we greatly increase the value of it because we've now removed it from a flood zone. And what happens with a LOMA? Then it no longer is being required to pay flood insurance if you're going to buy that house or sell that house. So it really does increase its value. Okay, so we don't physically lift it out of a flood zone like my picture shows. We actually amend a FEMA map and it shows up as not going to flood. Okay, so now the requirement for flood insurance is removed, and you're not going to require all that extra money, and you've increased the value of the structure. Now, what if the ground is too low? That's when Plan B kicks in. Okay, and what does Plan B mean? Plan B means, okay, we can't get this house out of a flood zone. However, okay, maybe, just maybe, we can make the house compliant. Now, I think I told a story before about a guy in a wheelchair who was a veteran. Let me tell you a quick story about this. One actually happened. I like to teach with my stories. This was up in Clarkston a few years ago, and it was a gentleman and his wife was like extremely pregnant, about to pop. She had 3 little ones running around, and she's going to have a 4th child. And they had realtors, 2 realtors involved, and they went to buy a house on a lake. They had all their life savings sunk into this purchase. And when they went to buy this house, CoreLogic, this out-of-state, non-licensed, non-regulated company, came back and told Wells Fargo, nope, you don't have to pay flood insurance. So Wells Fargo says we're not going to require flood insurance, and nobody bothered to look at the maps. Okay, Wells Fargo didn't. CoreLogic, some computer made that decision, so no person actually was involved. And there was 2 realtors involved, and neither realtor cautioned the buyer that he was about to buy a house in a flood zone. So everyone said, no, you're good. The guy proceeded to purchase the house, signed on the dotted line. Few months went by, the mortgage was sold, and now Wells Fargo came back and said, same document, but this time CoreLogic said, yep, you're in a flood zone. Sorry, you have to pay flood insurance. Well, the homeowner then said, wait a minute, I got another document when I purchased it said I didn't have to pay flood insurance. Okay, so again, the mortgage got sold, so it wasn't Wells Fargo the second time around, but the second lender said, yes, you have to pay flood insurance. It's $4,200 a year. A surveyor, a local surveyor, was called in. He checked it and said, sorry, dude, the flood zone line runs right through the middle of your house, and your garage is truly 6 inches too low. Okay, so when this happened, the guy was going to lose his house. He had a brand new baby, 3 other little kids running around, and a wife that couldn't work because she was trying to raise the children. And it was a single income family. He could not afford another $4,200 a year for flood insurance. The other surveyor said, we can't get this house out. The garage is too low by 6 inches. So then they called me in, and what did we do? We told them that all you have to do is install some engineered flood vents in your foundation of your garage, a couple walls of the garage, raise your AC unit on the water side of the house by a foot, which was a really easy fix. And within a couple weeks, we had filled out another elevation certificate showing that the house had been upgraded and vents were installed and the AC unit was raised. The guy went and got premiums from his insurance agent, and it was only $300 and some a year. It was just under $400. So again, he was going to have to pay $4,200 a year. Now he's only paying around $400 or less. He got to save his house. This is a really important point. That was a house that was an older home. It was non-compliant, okay? And what they did was they made the house compliant, as if they were building a house in a flood zone today. They installed the flood vents. They actually installed flood vents, and they raised that AC unit. And so what happens? You had a happy ending, basically. The guy got to keep his house, and it was all good, okay?
Carol,
Yes, ma'am.
we have a question that came in.
Certainly.
If a property is on a slab in the flood zone, is it likely there will be no or reduced flood insurance if it just depends on the elevation survey?
So that's a really good question. Okay. A lot of surveyors will tell you that the ground around the house throws the structure into a flood zone, which is true. However, if the slab, and by that I mean the living space or the area where all the valuables are, at the top of that slab is at or above the flood zone, then that structure would actually qualify to be removed. So let's talk about this in two parts. Part one would be, if we're not going to remove it, we would we'd write up an elevation certificate, which would register that there is no cavity under the house that's going to flood, that the ground around the house is too low, okay, but the actual living space or the main floor where all the valuables are, and probably mechanicals as well, would never have the water in that area. So therefore, if we do an elevation certificate on that structure, we could get greatly reduced premiums for that. Okay. Now we can actually take it that step further and at some point bring in some ground, raise the ground up around the structure, and then that structure would qualify to be removed from a flood zone. And the way that works is you can bring in ground and raise the ground around it, but we have to ask permission a lot of times from our Eagle, which is our DEQ. So if you had a buyer buying a structure with a slab on grade, and we would write an elevation certificate, we get that buyer to continue to buy it because there'd be reduced rates, then that buyer could come back once they own the house and they could say, okay, we want to get this house out of a flood zone. How do we do it? And we would hold their hand through the process. We'd make sure the proper permits are filed, raise the ground up around the structure. And again, as long as that slab, that actual elevation of the first floor is at or above the flood zone, it would qualify to be removed. I hope I answered the question. Is there any other questions?
Doesn't look like it at this point.
Okay, perfect. So I got one more quick story to tell because I like to teach with my stories, and we still have a few minutes here. This is a story that happened out on the Huron River in Livingston County, and it could have happened pretty much anywhere. But it's important to understand that we have people all over our state, all over our country, who are losing their houses, okay, and they shouldn't be. Many of these houses, in fact, in Michigan today, and I've said it before, 85% of the time in Michigan today, if the house is in a flood zone, 85% of the time I can get it out. Okay. So if people don't know they have options, so here's a quick story for you. It was a few years ago, probably more like 5-6 years ago now, where I had a realtor call me and she said, I have a bank-owned home and it's on the Huron River and the house is less than 2 years old. It's a 6-bedroom house. It's a beautiful big house and it's bank-owned, Carol. I've got a buyer. Can you check it? It's in a flood zone. My buyer doesn't want to buy a house in a flood zone. So we went out there, and as I was sitting there with my fancy equipment all set up there with the satellites clicking away, the neighbor came out, and he was in some little dinky house over on the river, and he came up and he says, this is a really sad story. And I'm like, what? And he says, the people who built this house, this was their dream house. They had 6 kids. They used to own my house. While they lived in my house, they built this beautiful new house here. They sold me my house and moved their kids and everybody into this dream home of theirs. They weren't even there for just over a year, and the premiums for flood insurance got to be so expensive they couldn't afford it. They did not know they had options. Nobody bothered to tell them. They lost their house to the bank. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there looking at my equipment and looking at the numbers saying, oh my gosh, this house was never in a flood zone. So I looked at the gentleman and I said, where is that family today? And he says they're living out of the back of a Chevy Astro van so their kids can finish out the school year. There was absolutely nothing I could do at that point. The house was already bank owned. It already had an offer from some other buyer. I'm sure it was a cheap offer, lowballed. And again, it was not really in a flood zone. It could have been removed. And so it was a sad, sad story. So the point I'm making out there is that we need to educate in general. We have to teach our realtors, we have to teach our lenders, we have to teach our insurance agents, we have to teach our building officials, okay, and more importantly, our homeowners, that they have options, okay? And it's really, really important that we get the word out. So I kind of already covered this before, but I'm going to cover it again. When I go up to a house to check it for the flood zone to see if it's truly in a flood zone or not, I don't care about your basement and I don't care about your crawl. At that point, I only care about the lowest point where you have the house and where the ground meets the house at the lowest point. Okay, it's very, very important. That's called the lowest adjacent grade. I don't care whether it has a basement. I don't care whether it has a crawl that goes into the ground. I'm checking where the ground meets the house at its lowest point. The type of flood that we're talking about is going to come from a flooding source. It's going to raise up from the flooding source, travel across the surface of the earth, and get to the house that way. We're not talking about a flood that's going to come up through basement walls, that's going to come through your crawl space walls. None of that matters. So the rule of thumb for FEMA, and I can't stress this enough, again, I don't care if we have a basement, I don't care if we have a crawl. If I find that the ground on the outside of that house is at or above the flood zone, that structure qualifies to be removed from a flood zone. Okay, so a lot of people look at those basements and crawls, and just because they're into a flood zone, they instantly think the house cannot be removed, and that is just not true. Okay, again, rule of thumb, if the water can't get to a structure, the water can't damage it. It has to travel across the surface of the earth. Okay, so let me check my time. Looks like I have a few more minutes here, and one other quick thing I wanted to show you. So in this particular case, there was a realtor trying to sell this house for, geez, I think she was trying to sell it for 5 years or something, and couldn't sell it. And the reason is, if you can look real close here, there's a sunken patio here. And when the builder built this house, he dug into the ground. I mean, literally dug in to create this sunken patio. All right. So if a surveyor was hired to do an elevation certificate, and that's what everybody seems to ask for, they would come in, they do an elevation certificate on the home, and the lowest adjacent grade on this elevation certificate would say that it would be way down here where the walkout basement is. Well, guess what? That walkout basement was about 2 feet into a flood zone. So everyone thought this house would not qualify to be removed from a flood zone. Here's another angle. You can see it a little better. So again, 2 feet into a flood zone here, people did an elevation certificate and reported this, and everyone thought it didn't qualify. The fact of the matter is they've hired me, and I came in, and in a matter of just weeks, I had this house out of a flood zone. How? Because here's the flooding source. Okay, it was a lake, and we have higher intervening ground here, and this was virgin soil. Okay, they just dug into the hill and created this beautiful walkout. So I have higher intervening ground. The water would never come from that lake to get to this house. It could not get over the hump. Okay, so I just had to do a fancy little topographic survey, submit it to FEMA, and prove that the water's not going to get to this structure. Okay, but on paper, everyone thought it was in a flood zone because of that low point. So I just wanted to point that out because a lot of people don't understand those. All right, so just in summary, I just want to say we've got several different types of LOMAs that we've talked about, getting people out of flood zones. Every LOMA we do today is electronic. However, we've got electronic, which are done really quick. And then I've got my regular LOMAs, which are like a Zone A non-study, and those are slow. Those could take 5 weeks, 6 weeks to do, okay? So that's why we want to teach you to be proactive. And I think I've already discussed a little bit about the LOMA RFs, but we're going to talk about those again in a little more detail in our next session. And of course, one other thing, we're coming up on a couple minutes here. The most important thing to understand is if I can't get a house out of a flood zone, then we switch gears while we're on the site and we say, okay, can't get this house out of a flood zone. Are there things we can do to get the premiums down? The one thing I do that I'm pretty sure no other surveyors are doing, but this is really important, is if you have a buyer and your buyer is just dead set on buying this house, We get out there, we check it, and we find that the ground is just too low. We can't help you. Can't get it out. It's too low. At that point, we switch gears and we decide at that moment whether an elevation certificate will help you or not. Okay. In the case of the guy who had the little babies and the wife that was going to kick out a new one in Clarkston, that would be a perfect scenario where if you had a buyer, had we been called in before that gentleman actually signed on the dotted line, we would have actually said, you're in a flood zone, you're going to buy a house in a flood zone. But what we would have done differently is we would have done an elevation certificate and we would show the existing conditions. So maybe he's getting quoted $4,200 a year. Then I give him an elevation certificate where his existing conditions are reported. And he turns that into his insurance agent. And now the insurance agent's going to write up a policy based on that elevation certificate. And it's going to bring the premiums from $4,200 down to maybe $2,700. But then I do a second document, a second elevation certificate. And again, this is what I do that I don't think anybody else is doing it at this point, is that second elevation certificate I would give him would be proposed changes. So this gentleman does not own the house yet. He still wants to buy the house. He loves the house. He really doesn't want to pay $4,200. So we give him an elevation certificate for the existing conditions. It gets the premiums down to $2,700 a year. At that point, he says, man, that's still a little steep. I don't think I can afford that. We give him that second document that says proposed changes. He has not purchased the house yet. He can't make changes to somebody else's house. However, we tell him to put 3 flood vents in his garage walls, and we tell him to raise that AC unit. He gives that second document to the insurance agent after they give you the $2,700 quote, and he says, what if I make these changes once I own the house? What then? What would my premiums be then? At that point, the insurance agent comes back with that second document and says, oh, well, if you put some flood vents in and you raise your AC unit, then it's only going to be $389 a year. At that point, you have not lost your buyer. Your buyer still wants the house because he knows that once he purchases that house, he can make a couple changes and come back and get those premiums way down. Okay, so that is something, again, that we do that I'm not sure any other surveyors are doing because I don't think they understand it. But we can usually get those premiums reduced literally 75% or more just by making some changes to the structure. Okay, so I think that's pretty much, we're right up against our time here. It's 12:30. Is there any questions? So what we're going to talk about next time when we come back, which is the final, is we're going to talk about a little bit more detail about how to make a house that's non-compliant compliant. And that is what we did with this gentleman's house in Clarkston. But we're also going to talk more about flood vents so you understand those a little bit more. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to jump out of my PowerPoint and we're going to show you how to look your properties up because that's really important. There's 2 or 3 really important things I want to show you there on the internet. And that's it for today. So thanks for joining us. Is there anybody else that has questions or are we all good?
Thank you, Carol. I don't see any questions coming through. So we will see you on Thursday to wrap up our flood zone series.
Sounds perfect. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Carol. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye now.